Shaheen, thank you for joining me today. Before we dive in, how have you been? How was your Ramadan? And Assalamu alaikum, by the way. Can you share a bit? Have you been involved with any of the recent protests and mobilizations around Palestine? And how has everything been on your side?
Wa alaikum assalam. So Ramadan was okay for me. It was bittersweet. I got to enjoy it here, but at the same time, I was in a state of crisis because knowing that my family's lives were in danger in Gaza, my family had spent, 15 months in a tent in Dir Balah, living in terrible conditions, including one of my cousin's nephews, baby Adam, and they were so relieved that even though their town in the north of Gaza, which has been devastated by Israel's attacks. Their home, like I want to say 15 to 10% of their home was destroyed. They were still thrilled to be able to go back to their land and go back to their home, and that they still had at least a majority of their home left, even though Israeli soldiers came in and sabotaged and destroyed, just in a wanton acts of destruction and violence, just destroyed what little they had. Now they've been made refugees again. So that was something that was weighing heavy on my heart and on my mind during this month.
I'm sending my solidarity and condolences, and I learned so much from you. To start out, could you tell a bit about your background, your family story, where you grew up, and how that shaped your understanding of the world?
Yeah. So typically, whenever I do any public speaking in regards to Palestine, I usually start off by mentioning that most every Palestinian is a living, breathing souvenir of one of the greatest crimes in modern human history. That most of us, we didn't, as I say ironically and jokingly, we didn't come here on the Mayflower.
Yeah,
Many Palestinians exist here in the United States and other diaspora communities around the world and in the West because, our colonizers deemed us too racially unfit to share the same land with them. And so we were forcibly expelled, those of us who survived. Every Palestinian family, most Palestinian families that did not willingly immigrate. They were ethnically cleansed out of their ancestral homeland. And so that's part of my legacy. So I guess the resistance, even attempting to live in spite of genocide and ethnic cleansing, is an act of resistance.
yeah.
So you could say that, resistance and resisting evil and resisting apartheid and genocide are forged into my blood. So that's, you could say, and a huge part of Palestinian culture is that we refuse to submit to the evil of Israeli apartheid and genocide. So I mean, that's kind of like part of my upbringing. I went to protest even as a kid before I could even understand the politics that were going on. And then, of course, I love the way Mustafa Bayoumi translates this famous question from W.E. Du
Yeah.
Bois. كيف تشعر ولديك إحساس أنك مشكلة? How does it feel to be a problem? That
Yeah.
ultimately, and this is not just limited to Palestinians, all of us people of color and diaspora and products of settler colonialism, whether, South Asian, East Asian, West Asian, North African, Central African, South American, wherever, that we didn't pick a fight with white supremacy. White supremacy chose us for exploitation and for mass murder. And so, that politicizes you. You grow up on watching images, derogatory and
Yeah.
incendiary minstrel shows of how brown and Muslim people are portrayed on TV. And it just like sparks this indignation in you. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how it came about. And then, my family is from Gaza, and in 2000, I want to say 2009, right before the Irvine 11 protest, Israel began what I would call, a regular ritual act of racial humiliation in which they would just bomb this ghetto, this concentration camp known as the Gaza Strip, and,
Yeah.
use weapons that do not differentiate between, any military and civilian targets against a, a civilian population, which, by the way, under international law has more of a right to defend itself than Israel has a right to enforce an illegal occupation, an illegal siege, and illegal apartheid measures. So anyways, that's just a little bit of my background. And I would just want to say in 2008, 2009, um, two of my cousins were killed in that first bombing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I felt this great sense of duty. I think all of us, and again, not just Palestinians or Arabs, but all people of color and diaspora communities, we have this kind of survivor's guilt that,
Yeah.
hey, we live in the first world. We're not experiencing, we do experience racism and bigotry and violence, but we kind of feel guilty that we're not facing the brunt of it as our families back home are, whether that's Karachi or Paktia or Mogadishu or Jakarta or wherever.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
So just for people who don't know about your culture, the Palestinian culture, under the circumstances, how do you maintain contact with your family back home? Just growing up, like, would you exchange letters, or did you go visit, or was there any of that? Or, like, how did you keep up to date with the news of what is happening, back home in your
So
family's homeland?
with larger clans like us, like news travels from family to family, like from family member to family member. So I eventually caught it through the grapevine that two of my cousins had perished in 2008, 2009. Now I don't want to give out. Hopefully, I'm not giving out too much specifics because Israel and unfortunately our complicit U.S. government are hell bent on denying Palestinians the right to exist and
Yeah.
insist on wiping us out. So I'm even scared to say this, but I've been recently messaging my cousins. I've been keeping up with them for a whole year on WhatsApp. They can get signal whenever they can charge their phones. We've been communicating through WhatsApp.
Yeah. I want to go into those formative years of, like, when you were entering UC Riverside. The years following 9/11 were marked by, a demonization of Muslims and the rise of tropes like, radicals, those sort of things. How did these narratives affect your growing up, in the US and your own political sort of development as an individual?
Yeah. I felt that it's funny because what some, I forget who it was, I think it might have been Professor Stephen Shii, is that the United States and many Western countries always had this Islamophobic, what's the word? Not ideology, a paradigm of seeing the world as bifurcated between Western enlightened Western civilization and Islamic savagery. Basically, they had this whole civilizing mission discourse that was confined to like think tanks and like government elected officials that after 9/11 was just let loose onto the world. We're at war with these Muslim savages. And so you know, there's this whole experience of the racial criminalization of not just people of color, but even specifically men of color as these untamable beasts, these existential threats to Western civilization that needs to put down. And this dates back all the way to the times of Jim Crow and chattel slavery, to indigenous genocide. But I feel like it exists. One of the ways it exists and manifests today is in the war on terror and the discourse of that
Mhm,
Muslim men are guilty until proven innocent, that we are
mhm.
suspect of potentially becoming of being agents of political violence.
So, like, during that period, especially during 9/11, if you recall, like, a major issue for Muslim Students Association and a lot of the SJP groups was emerging out of the Patriot Act and sort of the targeting of these groups under the auspices of being like terrorist sympathizers. Could you provide a context of that period? Because when we were getting involved with these groups, it was a place of community for us. But people forget that it was also a time of immense contestation and struggle for us as well, right? When they look at the broader student movement and the things taking place on campuses today. So you have this, could you like paint a picture of that?
Yeah. So we were at a time in which I still believe we still live in that time where violence, mass violence against Muslims and brown people throughout the world is socially acceptable to a disgusting and vile and genocidal degree. But I feel at that time in particular, there was a certain social acceptability of anti-Muslim and anti-brown sentiments. And this is, of course, not to limit, or obviously we recognize that anti-blackness has not abated and is intrinsically connected. Fighting
Mhm,
anti-blackness is intrinsically connected with freeing Palestine, with anti-Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. But I'm just saying
mhm.
that there was a strange degree of social acceptability for anti-Muslim rhetoric. I remember politicians campaigning on this, like whole entire politicians would have their whole campaign is I will not elect Muslims. I don't want to even touch a Muslim. I would never even be caught dead in a restaurant with a Muslim. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's kind of that was kind of the idea. So it was a time of hostility and fear, but alhamdulillah we had each other. I also want to say, man, I really appreciate you. I felt like you were a breath of fresh air, brothers like you on campus.
We were very close to our communities, and we were also trying to figure ourselves out, right? And I think university was that first like time period where we were outside of our communities. I just remember even like at Jummah prayers at like Riverside Masjid or like other places, we would be talking about, like how like FBI was trying to entrap these people. Like, and I do think like the way we navigated that in a very like positive way. A lot of times I felt like the Muslim community in general, like generally our social life was structured around the masjid on a certain level. And I think like our goal was to be inward, right? And I think it was a unique period of coming together and trying to understand, the context we were in and how to navigate that context, right? I think like so a little bit about your involvement with like Muslim students and SJP, because I think like SJP at that time period was kind of a new sort of organization on campuses, and it becomes this like very important space for not just Palestinians but Muslims in general.
Yes. So I do want to comment a little bit on what you said earlier. I forgot
Yeah.
to mention this, but I do want to say that one of the ways that we had to experience is structural and institutional white supremacy, and I see Islamophobia as one of the functions of institutional white supremacy, one of the
Yeah.
manifestations. And so we basically, essentially what Islamophobia is colonial racism that
Mhm.
in order to justify the wholesale slaughter of people abroad, in the effort to exploit their resources or their labor or steal land or whatever, they also have to dehumanize us here at home. And so we had to, we were basically, the US government, in a sense, sort of declared war on our existence and had so many programs to, there's entrapment, there's agent provocateurs, creating and engineering crimes that did not previously exist and would not exist
Exactly.
without the government engineering those. And that basically some of us just putting a brown man behind bars, a Muslim man behind bars, was some of the ways that these agencies and these law enforcement agencies that they collected their paychecks. We were a metric.
Mhm.
How many people of us can you put behind bars? How many people can you surveil
Yeah.
to prove the efficacy of your program? So I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, no, I'm listening. Yeah, like that was exactly what I was pointing to. I was saying like, just sort of trying to give a sort of picture of the constraints, because on one level this is taking place in society, but the university campus, which was supposed to be this sort of free space for education and political expression, is also seeing this push towards curtailing those sort of spaces, for us to express ourselves. And just like talking about that context, like post 9/11, 9/11, and how that influenced like sort of the work we end up doing at that time.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it radicalized a lot of us in a positive way, in the sense that we recognize that, evil has to face confrontation. And even coming from our Muslim tradition, we are obligated, mandated by God to confront evil, whether it's against our own community or anybody else in the world. I'll always like to say that Muslims don't have a choice of cowardice. We are obligated to do the morally just thing every time. And this is
Yeah.
part of our covenant and relationship with God and how we understand ourselves in the world. And I think I
Mhm.
can't think of anything more beautiful or noble. And I think, it's beautiful that the mosque itself, that Riverside Masjid, was sort of a place of sanctuary and community during these difficult times. And
Mhm.
also, and just to comment on what you said, we're probably going to touch base on this, but I always talk about the dual nature of the academy and how
Yeah.
it's also a base of creating intellectual resistance against fascism and oppression and injustice. But it's
Yeah.
also an instrument of institutional power and state power. And so sometimes the academy can, it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's a place where we can organize. Sometimes we have to be very careful because the administrators are by default in favor of whatever oppression we're fighting.
So I think like one thing I noticed at the time, because I think what SJP did for us was provide a sort of political education and a confidence in terms of our organizing. Because I remember like when I would go to the meetings, when I saw like people like Tahir or like, you and others, like this confidence that you guys provided us, to be okay, it's okay to be Muslim and say you're Muslim, right? And not be ashamed of that. It's okay to openly support Palestine,
Yes.
and that sort of confidence was something that SJB provided us. It was a pride in who we were. I would like to explore that a little bit, because that space was really unique, when it wasn't just an organizing front, but it was also like a place where people from different backgrounds from the community could come together and actively be more political. Because like I feel like in our communities we were taught to be non-political, right, on a level, and that was something we were trying to change, and I think we bonded on that fact to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I would frame it and look at it as like a general way that resistance movements from various cultures and organizing traditions have responded to how different communities have responded to oppression. There's like certain patterns that sort of repeat. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Yeah.
Was once famously said.
After 9/11, right, and the backlash, the certain state policies get enacted, George Bush actually sweeps the Muslim community and he visits the masjids. The Muslim community actually votes Republican at that time, which is kind of interesting, like when you think at the broader context where we're like, no, we got to take a stand. Sorry,
Oh
I
my
cut you
God.
off.
No, no, not at all. I feel like you're constantly stimulating the conversation in really interesting ways. So what I would generally say is that we have this patterns, and sometimes people try to respond to oppression by assimilating
Yeah.
or by adopting the racist or problematic politics of the demographic majority. In this case, what our community perceived to be white America. Of course, those demographics are changing. People of color will be the demographic majority by 2050, which in my case is my opinion is a really strong and beautiful thing. But yeah, some people just wanted to keep their head lowered, and if we keep our head down, we'll avoid it. And other people were saying that, I'm sorry, but by negating politics or political involvement or caring about the world that is happening right now, we are negating part of our obligation towards God. I actually give sermons sometimes, and there's a beautiful verse that you are commanded by God. God commands you to observe excellence and justice. So it's clear that God's mandating this on you. He didn't make it an option. But anyways, back in the day, I do want to say that I had the feeling that MSA was a little bit towards political neutrality, that like, hey, we're not really down for this. And it was really upsetting because that dynamic didn't exist in other universities. At UCI, it was the opposite. The
No.
assimilationist and I want to say the normalizing organization was the secular Palestine organizing space, which was, I
Yeah.
think, back then a sort of a normalizing organization. Of course, things have changed since then. And MSU was the powerhouse in political organizing for just causes, whether it was on behalf of,
Interesting. Yeah.
but yeah, SJP was the place where we had this like political education, and we were sort of like led towards a path of dignified resistance towards
Yeah.
oppression instead of acquiescing to oppression.
Yeah, yeah. I think like that was like the first space that I could openly. We started to engage with texts outside of the classroom, right? Like Edward Said, Chomsky, Fanon. Like we would be like after basketball, we would just be like sitting down and having discussions about like one state, two state solutions, different solidarity tactics. Like, and we were still very, very like, we were just trying to make a mark in that sense. And those discussions were very open and grounded. And I think like it was kind of a unique space that developed at that time. Could you give your sense of like how that space sort of developed?
Do also want to mention that back then, so Palestine wasn't the political landscape has changed so much. Like words like apartheid and genocide were restricted to like obscure political texts, that I was reading back then, but they were not part of popular discourse.
It wasn't.
Even settler colonialism, like the political landscape and discussion on Palestine has moved so much. It was very politically taboo to even
Yeah.
acknowledge that Palestinians are human beings and deserve to be treated as such. It
Yeah.
still is to an extent, but
Yeah.
there's more mainstream acceptance of this in American public now. So I feel like there was just those of us who had this sort of intolerance for what was going on, and we had a space that we could vent our frustrations, and that was SJP. And also to exercise, I felt like we're also like in a nation state, a settler colonial society that launches genocidal wars, not just against Palestine, but against Iraq, Afghanistan, even places like Waziristan and Balochistan, and these borderlands of Pakistan, and I felt like there was sort of an indignity in staying silent about that. And I felt like
Mhm.
we kind of had this anti-colonial angst that needed to be expressed. And I think that was a
Yeah.
beautiful space. And like you said, there was social events, but like they were structured around our collective